Somewhere between the trade lanes and the edge of known space, a station hangs in the dark like a lit window nobody asked for. Inside, 31 species conduct their careful business. Titles are spoken before names. Banners matter more than faces. And the rules, unwritten, unforgiving, hold everything in place like gravity nobody admits to feeling. In the maintenance corridor of Sublevel 7, a man pushes a cart of filters through the quiet. No rank, no banner, badge slightly crooked, hands that know which wrench fits which panel before the lights come on. He is not important here. That is what everyone agrees on. 2 floors above, in the cafeteria where the right people sit with the right people, a small girl with blue-silver skin and amber eyes, older than her face, presses both hands into her lap. Her food is untouched. No one looks at her. The man with the cart turns a corner, stops, and picks up the wrong sandwich. Part 1. The Far Table. Grady Wren had been on Oran Crossing for 31 days before he learned the most important rule of the station. Keep your eyes moving, never let them land. Not on the noble students in their pearl gray uniforms. Not on the trade delegates who walked like the floor had been built specifically for their shoes. Not on the floating monitors that hovered above the cafeteria like disappointed parents. And definitely not on whatever was happening at the tables you weren't invited to. Keep moving. Keep invisible. Do your job. He was good at it, mostly. 31 days of fixed dispensers and replaced filters and air recyclers that wheezed like old dogs in summer. 31 days of coffee that tasted like hot regret and shift timers that buzzed at exactly the wrong moment. 31 days of nodding at species with titles longer than his paycheck and pretending the recycled air didn't smell like the inside of a gym bag. He was fine. He was absolutely fine. His daughter Mara had said, "Go somewhere, Dad, before that house swallows you whole." And he had said, "I'm not being swallowed, I'm just..." And she had looked at him with the particular patience of a 26-year-old who had watched her father eat cereal standing over the sink for 8 months straight. And he had looked at the contract his supervisor had forwarded as a joke. 20 months on Oran Crossing, maintenance, benefits included, distance guaranteed. He'd signed it before he could think too hard about what that said about him. So here he was, 31 days in, fine, moving, eyes never landing. Until they did. The girl was sitting at the far end of the cafeteria dining hall at the table nobody chose on purpose. The one near the decorative plant from some low-gravity moon, the plant that had been slowly dying for what looked like several years and that nobody had replaced because nobody important sat near it. She was small, blue-silver skin, white hair with a faint violet sheen that caught the cafeteria light and did something complicated with it. Her eyes, when she glanced up for a half-second, were amber. Deep amber. The kind that looked like they'd been borrowed from something much older. She was 11 maybe, possibly 12, and she was sitting with her hands folded in her lap, very still, very quiet, in front of a tray that held 3 pale white cubes she hadn't touched. The cafeteria monitors floated above. The instructors stood in clusters near the service wall, talking about something important enough to require coffee. The noble students filled the center table's voices, precise and low uniforms, spotless. Nobody looked at the girl, not once, not even by accident. Grady noticed that. The not looking, the way it was too consistent to be coincidence. You had to practice that kind of not seeing. It took effort. It took daily renewal, like a decision that had to be made fresh every morning. He looked at his sandwich, then back at her, then at his shift timer. 40 minutes. He had a busted humidity sensor on sub-level 4 that was going to take at least 20 of them. He had a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he was arguing with a filter clamp, and his left shoulder still ached from the morning's equipment pull. He had a full, reasonable, low-drama lunch to get through. He thought about Mara. Not 8 years old this time, he thought about last Christmas. Her face across the table from his, careful and watchful, the way adult children got when they were worried about you but didn't know how to say it without the conversation becoming a thing. The way she'd kept refilling his coffee. The way she'd asked 3 times if he was sleeping okay. He picked up his tray, walked across the cafeteria, sat down. The girl looked up so fast it was almost a flinch, like she'd been trained to expect something bad from sudden movement. He unwrapped his sandwich. Chicken. Bread. One slightly wilted piece of lettuce he hadn't asked for. He set half of it on a napkin and pushed it across the table toward her. She didn't touch it, just stared. "I carry no house name here." Her translator made her voice sound careful, deliberate, like she'd said this sentence before and knew exactly where it landed. "Sitting with me will cost you." Grady looked at the sandwich, then at her. "Lucky for both of us," he said, "I don't have one either." She blinked. "You are human. Most days, you do not know who I am." "Nope." He took a bite of his half. "You hungry or not?" A long pause. The cafeteria kept doing its thing around them. The monitors floated, the students talked. The instructors found important documents to read. She picked up the half sandwich with both hands, held it carefully, like it might change its mind about existing. "Sael Orange," she said. "Just Sael. Grady Wren." He chewed. "Savannah, Georgia. I fix things that break, which on this station is a full-time situation." She took a small bite, chewed with the focused seriousness of a scientist running a controlled experiment. Then she said very quietly, "It does not taste like the station food. Station food tastes like warm pennies. I do not know what pennies taste like. You're not missing much." And that was the whole conversation, for a while, which was fine. Some silences were comfortable. Some silences were the kind you built slowly over the course of a meal, the way you'd build a fire carefully without rushing because rushing made it go out. Grady finished his half. She finished hers. He split the apple without asking, pushed the larger piece toward her. She didn't say thank you, but she ate it, and that was the same thing, really. Maybe more honest. He went back the next day. Not as a plan, as a fact. He walked past the broken drink dispenser, bought his sad cafeteria coffee, picked up an extra granola bar. He told himself was for the afternoon shift, and then somehow ended up sitting across from a small alien girl who was already at the far table, already waiting. Without looking like she was waiting, without letting herself look like she expected anything at all. He put the granola bar down next to her tray without comment. She looked at it for a moment, then at him. "You came back. So did you." She looked at the granola bar like it contained information she hadn't been given the key to yet. Picked it up, read the label which she obviously couldn't parse, and then looked at him with the patient expression of someone who would not ask for help, but would absolutely wait until help was offered. "Oat-based," he said. "Some kind of nut. Probably chocolate. They use the word chocolate very loosely on this station." She took a small bite, considered it with extraordinary seriousness. 6 out of 10, she said. "That's fair." He settled into his chair. "How do you score things 10 as my grandmother would approve? And 1? She looked at the drink dispenser across the room, the one that dropped cups sideways on a good day. "1 is that machine." Grady nodded solemnly. That machine is a -7. She didn't laugh, but something around her mouth changed. Almost, which he was beginning to understand was the CL or an equivalent of a standing ovation. Where are you from? He asked on the third day. Far away, flat, ready. That's a bad answer. It is the safest one. He stopped unwrapping his food. Thought about that. She was right, actually. He'd been around enough to know that far away was the answer people gave when the real answer had walls around it, when the location wasn't the point, but the person asking it was. Fair enough, he said. I'm from a town where it rains 9 months a year, and everyone pretends hiking is a personality. She looked at him like he'd offered her classified information. You miss it, sometimes. He leaned back. Mostly when the air recyclers make everything smell like a storage unit. Why did you leave? He thought about the honest answer. The kitchen that was too quiet, the cereal over the sink, Mara's careful face at Christmas dinner. Work, he said, which was true enough. Home is good, but good doesn't always mean it's the right place to be. Sael nodded, slowly, like that made more sense than it should. I was sent here to learn. About what? People. A pause. I do not think they like me. She said it plainly. Not fishing, not asking for a bandage. Just naming the weather the way you named weather because it was there, and pretending otherwise was exhausting. Grady looked around the cafeteria, the noble students in their clusters, the way conversations went quieter when Sael walked past, the way instructors found other things to look at. Maybe they don't know you yet, he offered. They know enough. She looked down at her food. No house name, no escort, no family colors. No one important has claimed me. Grady was quiet for a moment. Back home, he said finally, if a kid showed up at the lunch table alone, the decent thing was to make room. He picked up his coffee. If someone told you not to, you told them to find another table. Sael stared at him for a long moment, like she was trying to locate the catch, the angle, the thing he wanted in return. Humans speak as if rules are optional, she said. No. He took a sip. We just argue with the ones that deserve it. That almost made her laugh. Almost. The thing about Sael Oren was that she laughed the way some people open curtains in a house that had been shut up too long, slowly with a lot of testing whether the hinges still worked. When something struck her funny, the first thing she did was check whether anyone was watching. Not Grady, the room, the other tables, the monitors. He noticed that, filed it somewhere important. Also on day 3, she said something that stopped him mid-bite. She had been talking about the food, comparing the granola bar to something from her home system, something that apparently also stuck to things it wasn't supposed to stick to. And then without transition, without warning, I had a mother. She also left. Not she died. Not she's gone. Left. Which was a word with choices built into it even when there weren't any. Grady set down the granola bar. He didn't say, I'm sorry. He didn't say that must be so hard. He'd received enough of those words in the year after his wife died that he could feel their uselessness from the inside. Instead, he said, my wife passed 2 years ago. Sael looked up. What was her name? Ellen. His voice didn't shake. He'd practiced that. She was a nurse, better at crossword puzzles than anyone I ever met. Made terrible coffee on purpose because she thought it was funny to watch people be polite about it. Sael held very still. Did she leave you notes? She asked. He blinked. What, my mother left me notes? I was 4. I cannot read most of them. A pause so small you could miss it. But I keep them. Grady looked at her for a long moment, at the amber eyes that were too old for an 11-year-old, at the careful way she sat like someone who had learned early that the world didn't automatically make room. Ellen left me voicemails, he said quietly, when she knew things were going the wrong direction, just talking about regular things, the garden, a book she'd been reading. He stopped, started again. I still haven't played all of them. Silence. Comfortable this time. The kind you didn't have to fill. She sounds like she was good, Sael said. She really was. I think my mother was good too, Sael said. I only have 4 years of data, but it points that direction. And somehow that sentence, that very precise, very small, very Sael way of saying she missed someone, was the moment Grady understood he wasn't going to stop showing up at the far table. Not for a project, not for a cause, just because some people needed someone to show up. And showing up was the one thing he still knew how to do. On the fourth day, she followed him on a maintenance call. Not because he invited her, just because he'd stood up from the table after lunch and she'd stood up too, and he'd said, "You don't have to come," and she'd said, "I know," and then she came anyway. The maintenance call was sub-level 4, a humidity sensor that had been lying about its readings for 2 weeks and was starting to affect the climate system for that entire ring. Grady crouched under a console older than most of his tools, flashlight clenched between his teeth, one arm buried in the wiring. Sale crouched beside the panel, careful, not touching anything, but watching everything. "What does that wire do?" she asked. He pulled the flashlight out. "Tells the system how much moisture is in the air. What happens if it tells the system wrong things? Things get too dry or too wet. Then other things break. Because one sensor lies, everything else suffers." He looked at her. Yeah, he put the flashlight back in his teeth. Pretty much exactly that. She went quiet, thinking about something she didn't share. He tightened the relay. The panel stopped rattling. He slid out from under the console and sat up. "On Orange," she said, "the first rule is to know who matters." Sounds exhausting. It is safe. That's not always the same thing. She didn't argue, which was he was learning also very Sayel. She didn't argue things she already knew were true. She just got quiet in a particular way that meant she was adding the information to something she was building inside herself. Something careful and slow and very much her own. Above them, near a warning sign written in 7 languages, a small black drone hovered in perfect silence, its lens adjusted toward both of them. Grady had noticed it on day 1. He'd spent enough time around station equipment to know the difference between commercial drones, security drones, and the kind of hardware that was too expensive and too quiet to be either. This one was the third kind, the kind you only saw in footage from Dominion diplomatic operations, the kind that cost more than his shuttle ticket home. Kids who were actually alone did not get followed by that kind of machine. He'd decided on day 2 not to ask about it, because whatever was following Sael was above his pay grade, and because whatever she was carrying was clearly heavy enough already without him adding his curiosity to the pile. But he looked at it now, then back at her. "That thing yours." Her expression closed, fast and clean, the way shutters came down on a storefront. "I cannot say. That's a yes with paperwork. It is not dangerous." I didn't ask if it was dangerous. Then why ask? Grady began packing his tools, slow, methodical, because kids who are genuinely alone don't get followed by machines that cost more than my shuttle ticket. He slung the bag over his shoulder. "So whoever sent you here didn't send you empty-handed, which means you're not as alone as they're letting you look. Sael stared at the floor for a long moment. If you knew who I was, she said, you might act different. Grady started down the corridor. Probably, he said, I'm weird around important people. Last month, a trade delegate shook my hand, and I said, you too, even though he hadn't said anything. That one actually did it. Small, startled, a laugh that came out like it hadn't meant to, like it had been waiting behind a door someone had just bumped open. She covered her mouth. Too late. I'm serious, she said through her hand. So am I. He kept walking. Come on. Sub-level 7's got a clogged filter with opinions about itself. She followed. And in the corridor behind them, the black drone followed, too silent and precise, its lens adjusting with a soft mechanical breath that neither of them acknowledged out loud. Day 14. Sub-level 7's clogged filter got fixed. Day 16, Grady noticed Sael had started bringing a small notepad to lunch where she wrote down English words he used that she didn't recognize. Casserole, potluck, wrench. Day 18, he brought peanut butter crackers, and she spent 8 minutes conducting a serious scientific evaluation of why food would be designed to resist being eaten. It sticks to the roof of your mouth, she announced with the gravity of a coroner. That's the experience. That is not how food should work. We also invented traffic and taxes. Nobody said we were logical. She wrote traffic in her notepad, then looked up. Do you miss peanut butter? When you are away from Earth, I miss my daughter's cooking. I miss my neighbor's dog. I miss being able to call Ellen when something weird happened at work. He shrugged. The peanut butter I can transport. Do you call your daughter? A pause. Not as often as I should. Sael wrote something in her notepad. He didn't ask what. Lord Tabith Morn arrived on day 10. He crossed the cafeteria like a weather system. Pearl gray uniform, gold threading at the cuffs, the kind of clothes that made even a school lunch look like a political statement. 2 students trailed at his shoulders, matching his pace with practiced precision. Grady watched them come and kept eating. That he would later understand was the thing that got to Tabith most. Not defiance, not attitude, just the sheer absence of the reaction Tabith had built his entire social life expecting. The slight pause, the downward glance, the posture rearrangement that said, I know who your father is. Grady gave him none of it. He was a man 3 bites into a turkey sandwich with a cold cup of coffee and a shift timer ticking, and this kid in expensive clothes was an interruption he hadn't budgeted for. Tabith stopped beside Sael's chair, looked down at the granola bar in her hands, let the silence sit for exactly 2 seconds calculated before he smiled. How charming, he said through the universal translator. Smooth. The kind of voice that had been trained to sound polite while doing something else entirely. The unclaimed has found someone to feed her. Sael's fingers went still around the granola bar. Grady set his sandwich down. He didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice. He looked up at Tabith with the expression of a man who had spent 31 days listening to air recyclers wheeze and said, she has a name, and you're at the wrong table. Tabith's smile didn't flicker. That was the practice kind. The kind people wore when they'd been told their whole lives that their comfort was more important than anyone else's. I don't believe we've been introduced, Tabith said. I am Lord Tabith Morn. My father serves on the Dominion Advisory Circle. My family controls 3 trade corridors in this sector. He tilted his head. And you are the guy whose lunch is getting cold, Grady said. One of the students behind Tabith made a short sound, not quite a laugh, quickly suppressed. Tabith's eyes went flat for just a moment, then warm again, which was worse. "Enjoy your meal," he said pleasantly, "while it lasts." He turned, walked away. His little court followed. Grady watched them go, then looked at Sael. Her shoulders had pulled up toward her ears. She was staring at the table like the wood grain contained a code she needed to crack. "Hey!" He pushed the other granola bar toward her. "Eat." You should not have said that to him. Very quiet. He will not forget. Neither will I. She looked at him. Something complicated moved across her face. Not a readable emotion, more like several of them running in parallel, each one checking on the others. "Why do you keep doing this?" she asked. He thought about it, really thought about it. Not the easy answer, not the comfortable one. "Because somebody sat with me once," he said, "when I didn't think anyone would. Long time ago. Different cafeteria. Same feeling." Sael looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the granola bar, took a bite, said very quietly, 7 out of 10, and that was that. Day 23 began like any other day. Which was the thing about the days that weren't like any other day? They always started normal. The alarm, the coffee, the shoulder that ached from the previous morning's equipment haul, the shift timer already ticking down. Grady was in sub-level corridor 7 pushing a cart of filters and sealant packs when his tablet buzzed. "Maintenance alert. Auxiliary airlock 4. Low priority." He stopped, read it again. Low priority. Airlocks were never low priority. That was not how airlock alerts worked. That was not how any of this worked. An airlock alert was by definition a priority situation. You didn't downgrade it. You didn't categorize a sealed pressure door with low priority the way you labeled a minor plumbing drip. He frowned, tapped the screen to pull up the diagnostic report. The alert disappeared. Just gone. Before the report loaded, pulled from the system remotely fast and clean, like someone who knew exactly which string to pull and had been waiting to pull it. "That's weird," he said to nobody. He stood for a moment, cart handle in his hand. The corridor around him quiet. Too quiet. No student chatter. No instructor voices from the learning wing nearby. Just the low hum of climate systems and the faint click of his own boots against the polished floor. He turned the cart around. He found Wex near the equipment bay outside the auxiliary corridor, the young technician from Sublevel 3, the one whose personal communications unit Grady had fixed on day 9, without billing it through station maintenance, because it was a 15-minute job and Wex had looked like he'd been awake for 30 hours straight. Wex was resorting a parts bin that did not need resorting with the focused intensity of someone who had been told to be somewhere innocuous and was trying very hard to sell it. Wex. The kid looked up, eyes too wide, back straight too fast. "Hey, Grady, what are you?" "Airlock 4, Grady said. The alert got pulled. "You know anything about that?" Something crossed Wex's face, fast and specific. The look of someone holding information that was burning a hole in their pocket and had been burning there for a while. I was told not to, Wex." A beat. Then there was a student badge ping on the airlock control panel at 11:04, barely above a whisper. "House Morn Registry." Grady was already moving. "Don't say you told me," he said over his shoulder. He saw it from 20 meters away, through the corridor window of Auxiliary Airlock 4. The chamber lights had shifted to pale white, the settings used for cold storage species. Frost had already started clouding the inside of the glass. And against the far wall, sitting very still, eyes closed, hands folded in her lap, Sael. Not panicking, not banging on the door, not making noise or making trouble, just sitting there in the cold, in the same way she ate lunch and fixed her expression when Tabith Morn walked over, like she had learned that surviving politely was the safest kind of surviving there was. Grady's hands stopped, just for a second. Then everything else stopped with them. The fear, the timeline calculations, the internal voice that said, think about your badge, think about your contract, think about what Mara will say. All of it went quiet. He moved. Lord Tabith Morn was standing in the corridor, 15 meters from the airlock door. Uniform spotless. Two students with him, equally spotless, equally calm. He turned as Grady came around the corner. Lost human move. This wing is restricted. Educational purposes. There's a child in that chamber. A lesson, Tabith said with tremendous patience, requires a classroom. Grady looked at him for exactly 1 second. At the clean uniform, the calm face, the practiced eyes that had been telling rooms what to think since before Tabith could probably tie his own shoes. Then he looked past him, at the airlock door, at the frost thickening on the inside of the glass, at Sael's shoulders pulled up slightly now. Still not panicking, still surviving politely, still trying not to be difficult. He reached into the cart and pulled out the heavy manual override wrench. I have tools. Tabith stepped into his path. You have no clearance. I have a sensor that tells me that kid is losing temperature faster than her biology can handle. He kept walking. Around Tabith, the hand on his arm. Tabith's quick, certain he walked through like it was furniture. Get your hand off me. The airlock panel rejected his badge. Once, twice, 3 times. He dropped to one knee, popped the lower casing, and started pulling the manual access cover apart. The panel sparked when he forced the override relay. The screen went dark. Behind him, Tabith's voice sharpened. Security will hear of this. Good. Grady twisted the wrench. Maybe they can explain why they aren't already here. The lock fought him. 8 seconds. 10. His knuckles hit the edge of the casing and split open, and he didn't slow down. He thought of Ellen's voicemails he hadn't listened to yet. He thought of Mara's voice saying, come home soon, in the way she'd been saying it since her mother died. Careful, patient, not wanting to push. He thought of Sael saying, I had a mother. She also left. Like it was just information. Like she'd long ago decided she didn't have the right to want more. Come on, he said to the door. Don't do this. The lock gave. Hard metal clunk. The door swung out. Cold air rolled over his boots in a wave. Sael looked up at him. Her skin had gone slightly gray under the blue silver. Her breath was visible in the air between them. I did not touch anything, she said, like she expected to be blamed. I know. He pulled off his work jacket, wrapped it around her shoulders. It was too big, reached almost to her knees. She pulled it around herself like a door she'd been waiting for. I tried to wait, she said. You're done waiting. He lifted her carefully. Not like a hero, like a tired man carrying a scared kid out of the cold because nobody else had bothered to. Behind him, station security rounded the corridor corner. Uniforms, bright voices, already loud questions, already aimed at the wrong person. Tabith Morn folded his hands behind his back and arranged his face into the specific expression of an offended, noble, concerned patient, deeply sorry about the disruption. This human-damaged diplomatic property, he said. He forced entry to a restricted chamber and removed a student without authorization. The security captain looked at Grady, at the ruined panel, at Sael shivering inside an oversized maintenance jacket. Grady held her closer, looked at the captain. His voice stayed flat. She was turning blue. Nobody answered. Above the corridor, the black drone descended from the ceiling, its lens fixed precise unblinking on Grady's burned fingers, on Sael's trembling hands, on Tavith Morn's perfectly clean smile. And somewhere beyond the station, beyond the trade lanes and the diplomatic channels, and the very long list of things that were above Grady Wren's pay grade, a screen lit up in a room he would never be invited to. The woman watching it said nothing for a moment. Then she touched one finger to the arm of her chair. Pull up everything, she said. Not the noble, not the boy. Him. The soft restraint field wrapped around Grady's wrists and hummed each time he moved, and he stood in the corridor of Oran Crossing, thinking that he had, in the space of one lunch break, managed to save a child, ruin a panel, and apparently purchase more trouble than he could currently afford. He looked down at Sael. She was looking back up at him, still inside his jacket, still holding on. You okay? He asked. She considered this with her usual seriousness. You smell like machine oil, she said. Yeah, it is not unpleasant. High praise, Grady said. I'll put it on my resume. And then the security team had him by both arms, and the corridor was suddenly full of voices, and Tabith Morn was explaining something to the captain in a very patient tone, and Sael was being guided to a medical bench with a thermal blanket, and the black drone kept watching, and 31 days of keeping his eyes moving and never letting them land had come to this. A broken panel, a child safe, a man in soft blue restraints who had absolutely no regrets and was only slightly terrified about everything that came next. Part 2. The room where truth waits to be called. They did not use metal cuffs. They used a soft blue restraint field that wrapped around his wrists and hummed every time he moved, which somehow made the whole thing feel more insulting, like the station was being polite about arresting him, like it wanted him to know that even his detainment was being handled with diplomatic sensitivity. Grady Wren, 47 years old, maintenance technician, Georgia, in soft blue cuffs, because he had opened a door. They walked him through the administrative corridor on level 9, past walls of frosted glass and floating directional panels, past 3 different officials who looked at him the way people looked at a crack in an expensive vase, with the discomfort of someone who wasn't sure whose fault it was yet, but had strong feelings about the inconvenience. He kept his eyes forward. Behind him, down the corridor and 2 floors below, Sael was sitting on a medical bench wrapped in a thermal blanket and his oversized jacket. He knew this because he'd looked back once, just once, and she'd been watching him go with the particular stillness of a child who had learned not to call after people who were leaving. He faced forward after that. The review chamber on the administrative level was circular. Floating seats arranged in a ring above the central floor so that every official could look down without having to admit they enjoyed it. Clean white lights, no windows, the kind of room designed to make whoever stood in the center feel like a problem that needed solving rather than a person who deserved listening to. Grady stood in the center. Work boots, grease on his pants from the sub-level 4 job 3 days ago that hadn't quite come out in the wash. Hair not entirely organized, badge crooked because he'd clipped it back on in a hurry after the medic checked his burned fingers and wrapped them in white strips that were already peeling at the left edge. He was very aware of how he looked. The kind of guy nobody invited into rooms like this unless something had broken. Director Ashmel sat at the top of the ring. Narrow face, careful posture, the expression of a man who had spent a career making difficult situations smooth by deciding which version of events was least expensive to believe. Beside him, 2 station officials whose names Grady hadn't caught and hadn't been offered. Lord Tavith Morn stood at the left side of the ring. Uniform still spotless. Still that same practice calm, the kind you built by never having been told no by anyone with actual authority. Beside him, a family advocate in dark ceremonial robes who had the bearing of someone who charged by the hour and had never lost. Tabith's advocate began speaking before Grady had fully stopped moving. The technician entered a restricted zone without noble authorization. Measured, practiced, the cadence of someone reciting a document they'd already written. He damaged station property in the process. He then removed a student from an educational environment without permission from the presiding house or the station directorate. Grady looked at the advocate, then at Tabith, then at the advocate again. Educational environment, he said. Director Ashmel raised one hand. Technician Wren, you will have an opportunity to speak. I just want to make sure I heard that right. You will have an opportunity. There's frost on the inside of that door, Grady said. I have the thermal readings on my tablet if anyone wants to look at them. A small silence. The advocate cleared his throat. The chamber was within survivable limits for multiple registered species. Not hers. You are not qualified to determine. I installed the humidity and temperature sensors on sublevel 4 through 8. Grady kept his voice flat. I know what those readings mean. And I know what a body looks like when it's been in cold air too long. He paused. She was turning gray. The chamber went quiet. Not the polite kind. The kind that happened when something true had been said in a room that had been carefully arranged around saying something else. Tabith did not move. His face did not change. But his left hand held loosely at his side went still in a way that Grady had learned to recognize over 47 years of watching people who were pretending. Grady asked for the thermal log from the junction backup. Not the airlock panel log that was gone pulled when he'd forced the override and the screen went dark, but the backup environmental sensor at the corridor junction, the one he'd installed himself on day 8, the one that ran on the secondary climate system and recorded independently, temperature shifts, access attempts, badge pings, manual overrides. Pull it, he said. Director Ashmel looked at the station official to his left. The official looked at the advocate. The advocate looked at Tabith. Tabith looked at nothing in particular, which was itself a look. That data is restricted, Director Ashmel said, tied to station environmental systems under privacy protocol. Privacy protocol. Correct. For an airlock. The protocol applies to all restricted access environmental systems. Grady took a slow breath, in through the nose, out through the teeth, the way his wife used to remind him to breathe when he was about to say something he couldn't take back. Director, he said, I installed that sensor. I know exactly what it recorded. I know it recorded a student badge ping at 11:04. I know it recorded the temperature drop sequence. I know it recorded the alert suppression at 11:06. He stopped. You know it too. The room was very quiet. And that silence, that very specific, careful practice silence, told him everything he needed to know about whether anyone in this room was actually interested in what had happened in that corridor. You're not interested in what happened, he said quietly. You're interested in who's expensive to offend. A murmur moved around the ring, low, uncomfortable, like a stone dropped in still water. Tabith's advocate stepped forward immediately. This is exactly the pattern of behavior we've documented. Emotionally reactive. Substitutes personal sentiment for lawful order. Disruptive to station hierarchy. Grady looked at him. A child was locked in a freezing room, he said. I used a wrench on a panel cover and got her out in 40 seconds. He let that sit. I'll live with that. They made him wait in a secondary holding room while the review chamber deliberated, which was a generous word for it. Deliberated. What they were actually doing, what Grady was fairly certain they were actually doing, was figuring out which version of events best protected the people who mattered most to the people in that room, which was not as far as he could tell him or Sael. The holding room had one chair, one wall panel with a non-functional entertainment feed, and a narrow window that looked out into the corridor. Through the window across the corridor, Sael sat on the medical bench, still in his jacket. The thermal blanket had been removed at some point, traded for a warmer station-issue wrap, but she'd kept the jacket on over it. The jacket was pale gray with an Oran Crossing maintenance logo on the left shoulder and a coffee stain on the right sleeve that Grady had been meaning to address since day 4. She was sitting with her hands folded in her lap. Same position as the cafeteria. Same very still, very careful arrangement that said, I am not going to take up too much space. I am not going to be difficult. I am going to sit here and wait and be as small as possible so that nobody has any additional reasons to be frustrated with me. Grady stood at the window and looked at her and felt the particular anger of a person who had watched systems fail children while people with better clothes called it procedure. A station medic approached Sael with a folded ceremonial robe, deep blue, gold edging, something clearly expensive and clearly official, the kind of garment that came in a sealed case and cost more than Grady's monthly contract pay. Sael looked at it, looked at the jacket she was wearing, looked back at the medic, and shook her head. Very small, very polite. The medic tried again, gestured at the jacket, cold, not warm enough. This is better. Sael pulled the jacket tighter around her shoulders. Grady put one hand flat against the window glass. His tablet buzzed. Internal comm. Anonymous routing, which wasn't unusual on station maintenance channels, ran through shared nodes all the time. But the message itself was 3 words and a file attachment. Don't open this. Then backup log intact. Junction sensor 7. Unmodified. Time stamped 11:04 through 11:19. Full sequence. Grady stared at the screen. Then he looked up through the window into the corridor beyond the holding room. Wex was standing 30 meters down at the far end, pretending to check a wall panel that did not need checking. The kid wasn't looking at him, wasn't acknowledging him, was doing an extremely committed impression of someone who had not just sent a file through an anonymous comm route and was now waiting to see if the world ended. Grady pressed his palm to the comm button on the wall. Wex. The kid looked up, made eye contact for exactly half a second, then 2 station officials in administrative uniforms appeared at the corridor junction, said something to Wex that Grady couldn't hear, and Wex was walking away with them. His tablet still in hand, his back very straight, his steps a little too steady for someone who wasn't scared. Gone. 4 minutes, maybe less. Grady looked at the file on his tablet. He looked at the closed door of the holding room. He thought the backup log is unmodified. He thought the junction sensor recorded everything. He thought this is it. This is the thing they didn't pull in time because they didn't know I'd installed it. Then he thought they just walked Wex out of this building because Wex had told him. And now Wex was being moved. Quietly, efficiently, without drama. The way you moved a piece off a board when it became inconvenient. So now there were 2 things Grady knew. The truth existed, in a file, unmodified, time-stamped. And someone in that review chamber had already started removing every person who knew about it. He sat down in the one chair, held the tablet, did not open the file yet. Because opening the file meant having information, and having information meant deciding what to do with it. And deciding what to do with it meant again still the possibility of the deportation shuttle, the conversation with Mara, the particular flavor of shame that came from trying to do the right thing in the wrong room and losing. He sat there and he breathed. In through the nose, out through the teeth. Ellen, he thought, I could really use your opinion on this one. They brought him back to the review chamber 40 minutes later. The floating seats were still arranged above the floor. The white lights still made everything look like a procedure rather than a conversation. Tabith Morn was still standing with his advocate, still spotless, still the face of someone who was going to be fine no matter what happened next. Director Ashmel folded his hands on the surface in front of him, organized his face into something careful and institutional. Technician Wren. After deliberation, the Directorate has determined that your actions in Auxiliary Corridor 4 represent a serious breach of station protocol. A pause time precisely. You entered a restricted zone without authorization. You damaged station property. You removed a minor from an administrative situation without legal standing to do so. Grady watched him. Additionally, your request for restricted environmental data during this review has been noted as an attempt to circumvent station privacy protocol, which represents a secondary procedural violation. The word noted, like his request for evidence, was itself the problem. Pending full review, Director Ashmole continued, your work credentials are suspended effective immediately. You will be confined to holding level 4 until transfer authority is determined. Standard deportation protocol. I want the full junction log read into this record. Director Ashmel stopped. Technician Wren. The backup sensor at Corridor Junction 7. Grady kept his voice level, flat. The voice of a man who had decided he was done being quiet about it. Full environmental record from 1104 to 1119. Temperature sequence. Badge pings. Alert suppression timeline. He looked at Director Ashmel. Read it into the record. Right now. A long silence. Tabith's advocate opened his mouth. The technician is attempting to, I'm asking for evidence, Grady said, in a disciplinary proceeding about an incident I was directly involved in. He kept his eyes on Ashmole. If the data exonerates me, you have nothing to lose by reading it. If it doesn't, you have nothing to fear. He stopped. So what are you afraid of? The chamber went very quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet, not deliberation quiet. The kind of quiet that happened when the right question had been asked in a room that had been very carefully designed to prevent it. Tabith Morn's left hand went still again. Director Ashmel looked at the official to his left. Something passed between them. A glance. A half-second of negotiation conducted entirely in eye contact. Then the junction sensor data falls under restricted environmental access. This review does not have authorization to. You have authorization to do anything necessary to determine facts in a disciplinary case, Grady said. Station Charter, Section 12. I read the employee handbook on day 2. A pause. All of it. Another silence. Different this time. Because now there were people in the floating seats shifting slightly. Small movements. The kind that happened when official footing became less certain. Tabith Morn's advocate looked at Tabith. Tabith looked at nothing. Specifically nothing. Director Ashmole made his decision. Grady watched it happen in real time across the man's face. The brief sequence of calculations, the weighing of inconveniences, the moment when the wrong choice won. Pending full transfer of authorization. Ashmel said this review will proceed with currently available documentation. He straightened the surface in front of him like a man smoothing a tablecloth. Technician Wren, Given the severity of the protocol violations, this directorate finds sufficient cause to proceed with suspension of work credentials, removal of station housing, access, and initiation of deportation proceedings. The decision is, Grady looked through the glass wall. Sael had stood up. Not dramatically, not in protest. She'd simply stood. Like she couldn't sit anymore. Like sitting was no longer something she had the capacity to do while watching this happen. She was standing in the corridor outside the review chamber wrapped in his jacket, the thermal blanket pulled on the bench behind her, and she was looking through the glass directly at him. Her face was very still, the way it got when she was working through something big, the way it had gotten on the sublevel when she'd said one sensor lies and everything else suffers. Grady looked back at her. He kept his face calm, or tried to, because she was 11 years old and she was watching adults fail to protect her again, and the least he could do was not add visibly terrified to the list of things she had to carry right now. He gave her the smallest nod, the kind that said, whatever you need to do, it's okay, I've got mine. Sael looked at him for one long second. Then she reached up to the collar of his jacket and touched the silver pendant at her throat. Her eyes closed, just for a moment, like someone gathering something from a deep, quiet place inside themselves. The advocate was still speaking. Director Ashmel was still arranging his conclusion. Tavith Morn was still performing patience. Then every screen in the review chamber went black, simultaneously. No flicker, no warning, no power surge, just off. In the space between one word and the next, a sound followed, small, old, like a key turning in a lock that hadn't been used in a very long time. Then silence. The restraint field around Grady's wrist dissolved, completely. Between one breath and the next, the blue glow simply stopped, and the hum stopped, and his hands were his own again. He rubbed his wrists, looked around. Director Ashmel had his hands still raised from the gesture he'd been making when the screens went out. He hadn't moved, like the motion had been interrupted by something more important than itself. The station officials were looking at the ceiling. Tavith Morn was looking at Sael, his face, his perfect, practiced, composed face. Something had happened to it, just around the eyes and jaw. Something Grady had not seen there before. Fear, real fear, not performance, not posture, the actual thing. Because Tavith Morn had recognized that sound. And Grady, who had not recognized it, who had no context for it, who was standing in the center of a review chamber on an alien space station with recently released wrists and genuinely no plan, looked at Sail through the glass. She was standing with both hands wrapped around the pendant now, eyes open. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was deciding something large. When she decided to try the sandwich. When she decided to follow him to the sublevel. When she decided to stop covering her mouth when she laughed. The look of someone who had been waiting to choose something for a long time and had finally irrevocably chosen. Every door in the chamber sealed, smooth mechanical thuds one after another like a sentence being punctuated. The station lights dimmed, not like a power failure, but like a building lowering its voice before speaking. A symbol appeared on every screen simultaneously, a white crown, over a field of black stars. Director Ashmel made a sound, involuntary, low, like a man who had just realized the floor was a significantly different floor from the one he'd been standing on. One of the station officials stood up without being told, then sat back down, then stood again. Tavith Morn's advocate touched his sleeve, pulled him down. Tavith Morn knelt, and his face as he did it was the face of a person reassembling something very fast. the calculation running, the recalibration happening in real time. Grady looked around the room at the people finding their knees, then looked at Sael. She wasn't looking at any of them. She was looking at him. And she was scared, not the same scared as the airlock. This was different. This was the scared of a child who had made a decision she knew was permanent and was now standing on the other side of it, wearing a jacket that smelled like machine oil and watching a room full of powerful people discover who she was. And she was looking at him because he was the one person in this corridor who had been around for 23 days and still showed up at the far table. He held her gaze, steady, calm. The way you held yourself steady when the kid needed to see steady more than they needed to see true. Then Sael lifted her chin, just slightly, and said not to the room, not to the kneeling officials, not to the advocate frozen mid-word, said to the pendant, to the connection on the other end of that small silver signal, grandmother. I'm done watching. The central screen expanded. The crown symbol widened across every display in the chamber, bright and clean. And then the air above the review floor bent. A column of light opened, not dramatic, not theatrical, just present in the way that genuine power was present, not requiring performance because it didn't need an audience to exist. A woman appeared inside it, tall, still, dark ceremonial robes that moved like they were made of something heavier than fabric. Blue-silver skin, the same shade as Sael's but older, worked over by decades into something colder and more precise. Hair white, worn close, severe. Eyes that had spent a very long time looking at things from the highest possible vantage and had learned exactly what that view cost. Empress Valanthe. She was not what Grady had expected. He hadn't expected anything because he hadn't known to expect anything. But if pressed, if asked, he would not have expected this. A woman who looked underneath everything else tired. The way people who had been obeyed for 40 years without ever being contradicted looked tired. Like they'd spent so long being the answer that they'd forgotten how to be in the room with the question. She looked at the chamber, let her gaze move across the kneeling officials' slow and specific cataloging. Across Director Ashmel, who had somehow folded himself downward while still trying to project authority from the floor. Across Tabith Morn's advocate, whose ceremonial robes were pooling in an undignified way around his knees. Across Tabith himself. She paused there, 1 second, maybe 2. A pause that contained a judgment being completed. Then she looked at Grady, who was still standing, not out of defiance, not because he'd made a decision about it, simply because nobody had told him otherwise, and his knees weren't going anywhere on instinct alone. She looked at his burned fingers, the crooked badge, the grease on his pants, the clean white medical strips peeling at one edge, the general impression of a man who had been through a significant morning. Then she looked at his jacket, still around Sael's shoulders, outside the glass. You are the technician, she said. Her voice came through the translator without softening. Not unkind, but precise the way a well-calibrated instrument was precise. Yes, ma'am. Behind him, someone made a faint sound. Possibly Director Ashmel, reacting to the address. The Empress did not react to it. You opened the airlock, she said. Yes, ma'am, without rank. Yes, without clearance. That's also true. Why without? The chamber held its breath. Every kneeling official waited. Tabith Morn, from his position on the floor, watched with the focused attention of someone trying to calculate which direction this was going before it arrived. Grady looked at the Empress. He had nothing grand, no speech, no prepared statement, no version of events structured for a favorable outcome. He'd spent the last 40 minutes sitting in a holding room talking to a woman in his head who had been gone for 2 years. He had one thing. Because she was cold, he said. Through the glass, Sayel pressed her lips together, tight, like she was holding something in that needed holding. The Empress was quiet for a moment, looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not warm, not cold. Something between those things that he didn't have a name for yet. Then she turned and looked at Director Ashmel. "Bring me the log," she said. Director Ashmel's mouth opened. "Your Majesty, the matter is currently under local review. Privacy protocol requires." The Empress looked at him. His voice stopped, quietly, like a candle going out. "No," she said. "It is under mine now." And the room understood all at once without discussion that the floor they were kneeling on had changed. On the screen behind the Empress, the junction sensor log began to populate, line by line. Day 23, 11:04. Badge Ping House Morn Student Registry Airlock Panel 4. 11:05. Chamber temperature drop initiated. Manual setting adjustment, same registry. 11:06. Emergency alert generated by station safety system. Alert suppression request received. Alert suppression approved. Authorization, Director Ashmel Administrative Override. 11:07. Royal Emergency Pendant activated. Signal received by Station Communication System. Signal classified as low priority false alarm. Flagged for non-response. Authorization, Director Ashmel. 11:14. Manual override of airlock panel. Unauthorized. 11:14:40. Chamber door opened. Temperature normalized. The room redded in silence. Not dramatic silence. Not shocked silence. The heavy silence of a room full of people watching something true be read aloud that had been working very hard not to be. Grady read the line again, the one he kept going back to. Signal classified as low priority false alarm, flagged for non-response. She had called for help. Inside that airlock in the cold, sitting with her hands folded so she wouldn't touch anything she wasn't supposed to touch, she had activated the pendant. She had sent the signal, and the station had received it. And Director Ashmel had decided that a royal emergency signal from a child in an airlock was a false alarm. Because answering it would have created a diplomatic situation. Because answering it would have meant dealing with Housemorn. Because answering it was inconvenient in ways that the safety of one unclaimed child was not. Grady looked at Director Ashmel. Ashmel was looking at the floor. The Empress had been silent for the duration of the log reading, standing inside her column of light. Still, precise, the way something went still just before it moved. Grady counted 8 seconds. He wasn't sure why he counted. He just did. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And in those 8 seconds, he watched the most powerful woman he had ever been in a room with become briefly, completely a grandmother who had just read proof of what had happened to her granddaughter in her absence. It was not a large change. It was in the eyes, in the quality of stillness. But he saw it. And he thought, this is what it costs, to be the one who has to be looked at and not the one who gets to look after. The Empress turned her gaze to Director Ashmel. She activated the royal signal, the Empress said. Her voice had not changed pitch, had not risen, had not sharpened, was still the same precise, calibrated tone, which somehow made it worse while she was in the airlock. Ashmel said nothing, and you classified it as non-priority. Your Majesty, without confirmation of the signal's origin? The signal carried the royal identifier, the Empress said. It has carried that identifier since she was 4 years old. Silence. You knew, the Empress said. Not a question. Ashmel's jaw moved. Nothing came out. The Empress looked at Tavith Morn, still kneeling, still composed, still trying to be whatever the most strategic version of himself was in this situation. You locked a child in a restricted chamber, she said. She was 11. Tavith lifted his head slightly. Your Majesty. Had I known her identity, she was 11, the Empress said. Without her identity. That was the point. Tavith closed his mouth, and for the first time since he'd walked into the cafeteria on day 10, with his spotless uniform and his practiced smile, Lord Tavith Morn looked like exactly what he was. A 19-year-old boy who had never been told no by anyone with actual power, and had just been. The Empress turned back to Grady. The data you requested, she said. You knew it existed. I installed the sensor, he said. Day 8. The junction backup was running on independent power, separate from the airlock panel. He stopped. I knew it would have the full sequence if no one had physically removed the hardware. And if they had removed it, then I'd have found something else, he said. Or I'd have said what I knew and let the room decide what to do with a man's word against a lord's. The Empress studied him. Would you have done it differently, she asked, knowing what it cost you? He thought about that, really thought about it. The badge, the contract, the conversation with Mara he was going to have either way, the holding room, the cold coffee, the 8 months of cereal over the sink. He looked through the glass at Sayel, at the jacket around her shoulders, at the notepad she left on the medical bench, open to a page with the word potluck written in her careful, precise handwriting. No, he said, I wouldn't. Through the glass, Sayel watched. She had been watching the whole time, standing very still, pendant, still held in both hands, reading the room through the glass the way she'd been reading cafeterias since she arrived, looking for the exit, for the threat, for the one face that wasn't performing something. Finding Grady's. She had been doing a calculation, the kind that children did when they lived at the intersection of extraordinary circumstances and ordinary fear, weighing what it would cost to use the pendant against what it would cost not to. And she had decided. Not for herself, he was fairly certain of that. She'd been managing her own situation with a composure that went well beyond anything expected of an 11-year-old. She'd been managing it with the quiet expertise of a child who had been managing her own situations for a long time. She'd decided for him, because he'd opened the door, because he'd split the sandwich, and the apple, and the granola bar, and the peanut butter crackers, and because he'd said, you're done waiting, when he lifted her out of the cold, and she had needed apparently to hear someone say that. And so she had spent her secret, the one she'd been carrying for 23 days, for longer probably, for however long she'd been the hidden granddaughter of the most powerful ruler in the known galaxy, sitting alone at the far table with her hands folded in her lap. Grady looked at her through the glass. She looked back, small, still in his jacket, amber eyes too old for her face. He gave her the same nod as before, the one that said good. You did good. She held the pendant a little tighter, and the Empress inside her column of light at the center of the chamber raised one hand. The junction log will be entered into the formal record, she said. In full. She let the words settle. Director Ashmel, Lord Tavith Morn. A pause that had the quality of something being measured very carefully. We will speak next in a more appropriate setting, which was Grady understood from the way Ashmel's shoulders dropped and Tabith's jaw locked, not a reassurance. Not even close. The Empress looked at Grady one last time before the column of light changed, before the next conversation began, before whatever came next in a room that had just rearranged its entire understanding of what the floor was. "Your hands," she said. He looked at the burned fingers, the white medical strips peeling. "I've had worse," he said. "I know," she said, and something in the way she said it made him think she was not talking about his hands at all. "Stay," she said. "There are things that need to be said in this room before they can be said anywhere else." And Grady Wren, maintenance technician, Georgia, 47 years old, stood in the center of a review chamber that had spent its entire existence making people feel small, and did not feel small. He wasn't sure exactly when that had changed. Somewhere between day 1 and day 23, between a broken drink dispenser and an apple split without asking. Between "I'm not people, I'm maintenance, and you're done waiting." He was still tired, his shoulder still ached, his fingers were still burned, and his coffee from this morning had been genuinely terrible. But he was standing up straight in the right room at the right time. And through the glass, Sael was still holding the pendant. And outside, somewhere in the station's bureaucratic machinery, a full junction log was entering the formal record, time-stamped and unmodified, telling the truth the room had been trying very hard to avoid. Part 3. What arrives late can still arrive. The first thing the Empress did was nothing. That was the part nobody talked about afterward. They talked about the log, the judgment. The moment Tabith Morn's family banner came down from the student registry. They talked about Director Ashmel's face when the Empress said his name in that particular tone. She had the tone that sounded like a door closing on something permanently. But nobody talked about the 8 seconds. The 8 seconds when Empress Valanthe stood inside her column of light and read the final line of the junction log and did absolutely nothing. Did not speak. Did not move. Did not arrange her expression into the version of itself that rooms like this were designed to receive. Just nothing. 8 seconds of the most powerful woman in the known galaxy being something other than powerful. Grady counted them. He didn't know why. He just did. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Then she turned to Director Ashmel, and whatever had been in her face for those 8 seconds was gone, replaced by something cleaner and colder and considerably more expensive to be on the wrong side of. She activated the royal signal, the Empress said, while she was in the airlock. And the room understood all at once, without anyone having to explain it, that the conversation had changed shape entirely. The log stayed on the screen. All of it, line by line. Nobody moved to close it. Nobody moved at all, because nobody wanted to be the person who moved while the Empress was reading. Signal classified as low priority, false alarm. Flag for non-response. Authorization Director Ashmel. The Empress read it twice. Grady watched her read it twice. The second time was worse than the first. The first time was information. The second time was a woman making absolutely certain she had understood something correctly before she decided what to do about it. She sent the signal, the Empress said. Not to the room, not to Ashmel specifically. Just set it into the air, like confirming it to herself. From inside the airlock. She sent it and the station received it, and you classified it as non-priority. Ashmel said nothing. There was no version of an answer that helped him here, and he seemed to have finally arrived at understanding that. You knew the royal identifier, the Empress said. Your Majesty, you have held directorial authority over Oran Crossing for 11 years, she said. You have received the mandatory briefing on royal emergency protocols 4 times, including, she paused, the specific section on pendant activation. The chamber was so quiet Grady could hear his own pulse. "You knew," she said, "and you chose not to answer." Ashmel's mouth opened. His jaw moved. The words that came out were small and careful and built entirely of administration, without secondary confirmation of origin. Standard protocol for unverified signals. "A child was in an airlock," the Empress said. That was the secondary confirmation. Silence, complete, final. Grady looked at Sael through the glass. She was watching her grandmother, reading her face with the focused attention she brought to everything. The granola bar rating, the humidity sensor, the word potluck written in a notepad. That same careful, patient observation. And Grady saw just for a moment the grief of a child who loved someone and had spent a long time not being sure that person would show up. Showing up now, in a column of light, 8 seconds too late and also somehow exactly on time. The Empress turned to Tavith Morn. Tavith was still on his knees, which was where he'd been for the last several minutes and which Grady suspected was a position Tavith had very limited experience with in any context. "You locked a child in a restricted chamber," the Empress said. "Your Majesty." Tavith's voice was controlled, careful, the voice of someone who had rehearsed contingencies. "I was not aware of her identity." "Had I known she was 11, the Empress said, "without her identity." Tavith closed his mouth. "You chose her because she had no banner," the Empress said. "No escort, no family colors, no visible claim." A pause. "You chose her because you believe the absence of those things made her a safe target." The advocate started to speak. One look from the Empress, and he stopped. "That belief," she said, "is precisely what I sent her here to measure." The room shifted. Something changed in the air, a subtle realignment, the way a crowd shifted when they understood the performance they'd been watching was not the performance they'd thought. Tavith's face moved. Just slightly. Not remorse. Something closer to the recalculation of a person who had just realized they'd been used as evidence without their consent. Which was fair, in a way, because they all had been. The Empress looked at Grady. "Sit down," she said. He looked for a chair. There wasn't one in the center of the chamber. One of the station officials, moving with the speed of someone very eager to be helpful, produced a chair from somewhere near the wall and placed it behind him. Grady sat. The Empress was quiet for a moment, organizing something. He got the impression that whatever she was about to say, she had been deciding how to say for longer than this conversation. "Sael was not sent to Oran Crossing to study," she said. "The chamber waited. She was sent because I needed to know what this station was." She paused. What this system was. How it treated the ones it had no reason to protect. She looked at the floating seats above, at the officials who had spent the last hour managing this situation toward its most convenient resolution. "I have done this 7 times. On 7 different stations across Dominion space. I send someone I love into a room without her name, and I watch what the room does." Nobody spoke. 6 times the Empress said the room did what rooms like this do. It looked away. It managed. It protected its own convenience and called it order. Grady felt something happening in his chest. A slow recognition of something large and heavy and very sad. "She was here for 23 days, the Empress said. "I watched every day of it." He thought about the drone he'd noticed on day 1 that he decided was above his pay grade. The drone that had adjusted its lens every time he sat down at the far table, every time he split an apple, every time he told a story about Georgia rain or terrible coffee or peanut butter's fundamental design flaws. She had watched every day of it. including day 3, when Sael had said I had a mother. She also left. And he had said my wife passed 2 years ago. And they had sat in comfortable silence over granola bars in a cafeteria where nobody looked at them. The Empress had watched that. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. He filed it somewhere to examine later when he wasn't in a room with floating seats and a ruler of the known galaxy. You were not supposed to be part of the equation, she said. And something in her voice changed just slightly on that sentence, like she was being honest about something that surprised her too. The test is designed around absence, around whether the systems respond, whether the protocols protect, whether the people in authority choose correctly when correctness is inconvenient. She paused. It is not designed around the possibility of a maintenance technician from Georgia who reads the employee handbook on day 2 and installs backup sensors because he noticed a gap in the coverage. Grady said nothing. The test measures systems, the Empress said. You are not a system. He sat with that for a moment. That's a hard thing to do to a child, he said. The test. The Empress looked at him. Yes, she said. One word. Just one. But in it, if he was reading it right and he thought he was everything she hadn't figured out how to say to Sael yet. The weight of a decision that had made sense as policy and turned out to cost something she hadn't fully priced. Yes, she said again, softer. It was. Outside the glass, Sael was watching her grandmother. Not with anger, not with accusation. With the careful, patient, thorough observation she brought to everything she examined. Like she was gathering data. Like she was deciding what the data meant. Grady watched her watch the Empress and thought this is the actual conversation. The one happening through glass and silence between two people who were family and hadn't quite figured out how to be that yet. Everything else, the log, the judgment, the officials rearranging their understanding of what had just happened to their careers, that was procedure. This was the thing that mattered. The judgments were swift, which surprised nobody who had been paying attention to how quickly rooms rearranged themselves around power. Lord Tavethmorn was informed quietly and completely that his family's advisory privileges were suspended pending full inquiry, that his student registry on Oran Crossing was closed effective immediately, that his father would be receiving a formal communication from the royal office before the end of the day, a communication that Grady gathered from the way the advocate went pale, would not be comfortable reading. Taveth was escorted from the chamber by 2 station security officers who had not been the same officers who'd walked Grady in. Different faces, straighter posture, the kind of posture that came with an entirely different set of instructions. He didn't look at Grady as he left, which was fine. Grady hadn't needed anything from him. Director Ashmel was informed that his authority over Oran Crossing was suspended immediately and that a full audit of station safety protocols, emergency response records, and administrative override usage over the past 3 years would be conducted by the Royal Office directly. Ashmel said something quiet to the official beside him. The official didn't respond. Grady watched him stand, watched him look around the chamber like he was searching for the version of this room where he was still the most important person in it, not finding it. The station official to Ashmel's left handed him something, a physical notice actual paper, which felt very deliberate. The kind of deliberate that was a message about the permanence of things. Ashmel walked out. Grady didn't watch him go. Wex came back. Not immediately, not dramatically, just appeared in the corridor outside the chamber about 20 minutes after Ashmel left, holding his tablet, looking like a person who had been having an extremely eventful morning and had not yet decided how he felt about it. A station official approached him. Different uniform from the ones before. A royal auditor's insignia on the shoulder. Short conversation. Wex nodded. The official made a note. Wex looked through the glass and found Grady. Made eye contact. Grady gave him a nod. Wex gave a nod back. Small, slightly shaky. The nod of a person who had done a terrifying thing and had come out the other side of it still employed. More than employed, as it turned out. The royal auditor spent 3 minutes with Wex and left him with a document that, from the way Wex kept looking at it and then looking away and then looking at it again, appeared to contain information he hadn't anticipated. Grady found out later it was a formal commendation and a grade reassignment upward for independent action in support of accurate record keeping under institutional pressure, which was a very formal way of saying he told the truth when he didn't have to, which was, Grady thought, exactly right. A new director arrived on Oran Crossing before the cafeteria opened the next morning. Her name was Administrator Phelan Dross. She had a short resume, a direct manner, and the efficiency of someone who had been given clear instructions and was not interested in finding reasons to complicate them. She found Grady in the corridor outside his quarters at 7:15. Handed him his badge. "Your contract is reinstated," she said. "Full terms, retroactive from suspension." He looked at the badge, the Oran Crossing maintenance logo, his name, the photograph that made him look like he'd been caught mid-blink at something he'd found only moderately impressive. "Thank you," he said. "There's a repair backlog from yesterday," she said. "Sub-level 3 humidity relay and a filter unit in the West Learning Ring. I'll get to it." She started to leave, stopped, turned back. "The technician who sent you the file," she said. "Wex." "Yeah. He's been reassigned to senior maintenance coordination, effective today." A pause. "He'll be reporting to you." Grady looked at her. "I'm not senior anything." "You are now," she said, and left. Grady stood in the corridor holding his badge, looked at it for a moment, then clipped it on. Slightly crooked because that was where it landed, and straightening it felt like more effort than the universe currently warranted. The decree went out across Oran Crossing before breakfast. Plain words, 13 languages, no ceremony, no announcement, just there on every public screen in every corridor and common area, and learning hall and cafeteria in the station. By order of the Empress Valanthe, effective immediately across all stations. Under Dominion protection, every person within these walls, worker, student, guest, refugee, trader, traveler, named or unnamed, will be treated as a person before they are treated as a problem. Administrative protocol will not override this principle. Station hierarchy will not override this principle. House affiliation or the absence of it will not override this principle. The dignity of an individual does not require sponsorship. That was it. No flourish, no additional clauses. Grady read it on the screen in the maintenance corridor while waiting for the elevator. Read it again. The elevator arrived. He got in. The elevator operator, a station worker he'd nodded to 17 times without either of them ever saying anything, looked at the screen visible through the closing doors. "Short," the operator said. "Yeah," Grady said. "Good short or bad short?" "Good short," Grady said. "Means they weren't trying to hide anything in the middle." The operator considered this, nodded slowly. The elevator descended. The maintenance staff on Oran Crossing started calling it the Wren Rule. Not officially. Never officially. Officially, it was Administrative Decree 7 Valanthe, which was what you called a thing when you wanted it to be taken seriously in documents. But in the corridors, in the equipment bays, in the shift handoffs, in the lunch breaks, and the early morning filter checks, the maintenance staff called it the Wren Rule. Grady found out on day 2 after the decree. Wex mentioned it, casually, in the middle of a conversation about a sub-level pressure valve like it was something Grady obviously already knew. Absolutely not, Grady said. Wex blinked. It's already everywhere. Uneverywhere it. I don't think that's how it works. Wex. I really don't think. Find another name. Wex pulled out his tablet, made a show of looking something up. Nope, he said, already logged. It's in the station record. Informal designation, but still. Grady looked at him. You enjoy this, Grady said. A little bit, Wex said. Yeah. Grady went back to the pressure valve and did not under any circumstances acknowledge the small and completely unprofessional warmth somewhere in his chest that had been sitting there since he'd read the decree for the second time in an elevator. Sael found him in the cafeteria the next morning. He'd gotten there early. Force of habit early shifts, early coffee, sit with the bad coffee before the room filled up and the cafeteria started doing all its complicated cafeteria things. He had his tray, his coffee which had not improved, his half sandwich which was turkey probably. He was at the far table, not on purpose, just that was the table he went to, had been going to for 23 days. His feet knew the route. Sael appeared in the cafeteria doorway at 7:40. She stopped when she saw him. Then she walked across the room and sat down across from him. Still in his jacket, the royal attendants had been to see her, he knew. Had brought 3 warmer robes and 1 ceremonial cloak that looked expensive enough to resolve several international disputes. She had kept the jacket. It still smelled like machine oil. You smell like machine oil, he said. I know, she said. It is comforting. That might be the saddest review my laundry has ever received. 8 out of 10, she said. The smell of my jacket is an 8 out of 10. I revised upward, she said. Context matters. He pushed the granola bar toward her. She took it, read the label new habit acquired over 23 days and looked up. Same brand, she said. Consistent, he said. 6 out of 10. You've never given it higher than 6. It has never earned higher than 6. He drank his coffee. She opened the granola bar with the focus of a surgeon. The cafeteria began to fill slowly, differently than before. The noble tables were not empty, but they were quieter. The instructors stood closer to their students. The monitoring staff moved differently, less hovering, more present. Small things, subtle, the kind of change that happened not because anyone announced it, but because the room itself had learned something it couldn't unlearn. Grady noticed it. He didn't say anything about it. Didn't need to. The Empress arrived at 8:15. No announcement, no procession, no forewarning for the cafeteria staff who had approximately 4 seconds to process that the most powerful ruler in the galaxy had just walked into their dining hall and was now looking at the menu board with an expression of genuine inquiry. The cafeteria stood, all at once. Chairs scraped. A serving spoon fell somewhere near the back counter. Grady started to stand. Sael put her hand on his sleeve. Stay, she said. So he did the thing where he was halfway up and then halfway back down and then fully back down in the specific awkward way of a man who had made a decision in front of royalty and was trying to commit to it. The Empress crossed to the table. She was wearing simpler clothes than yesterday. Still formal, she was always going to be formal, it was built in, but the dark ceremonial robes were gone. What she wore now looked less like the garment of a ruler and more like the garment of a person who had made a decision that morning about what kind of day she was going to try to have. She stood at the table, looked at the 2 chairs, looked at Grady. May I, she said. Not quite a question. Not quite not a question. Chair's yours, he said. She sat, not at the head of the table, not at the dominant position, just beside Sael. The way you sat when you wanted to be next to someone more than you wanted to be across from someone. Sael looked at her grandmother. Grandmother looked at granddaughter. Something passed between them that Grady had no business being inside of, so he looked at his coffee and gave them a second. Just a second. Because some conversations needed to happen in their own time, and this was one of them. But they were at his table, and he was in the middle of them, which made the next move his problem to solve. He looked at his sandwich, cut it in three, two even pieces and one slightly smaller one that he kept. Pushed the larger toward Sael, pushed the other toward the Empress. The royal attendants standing at a respectful distance, with expressions of people managing significant professional feelings about this situation, went very still. The Empress looked at the piece of sandwich in front of her, looked at it carefully, like she was making sure she understood it correctly before deciding what to do. "Is this a human custom?" she said. "Not officially," Grady said. "But where I come from, if you sit at the table, you eat." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression moved. Not warm exactly, something more complicated. The expression of a person who had spent decades being treated with extraordinary ceremony and had just been handed a piece of turkey sandwich by a man in a crooked badge and found the two experiences surprisingly comparable in terms of their effect on her. She picked up the sandwich, held it with careful fingers. "My granddaughter," she said, "speaks highly of peanut butter." Grady looked at Sile. Sile looked very carefully at her granola bar. "It has a complicated reputation," Grady said. "I am told it adheres to the roof of the mouth. That's the experience. I do not understand why that is desirable." Honestly, Grady said, "Neither do I. But she seems to be working through it." Saya looked up. "7 out of 10, she said with dignity. I revised upward. The Empress looked at her granddaughter, and something happened in her face. Quiet, private. The kind of thing that happened when you'd been away from someone for too long and then sat next to them and heard them say something ordinary, not important, not significant, just ordinary, and realize how many ordinary things you'd missed, how many ordinary things had happened without you, how many granola bars had been rated on a scale you'd never been told about." She took a bite of the sandwich, chewed, considered. "The station label says turkey," she said. "Station labels are more like suggestions," Grady said. "Then what is it?" "Probably turkey." She set the sandwich down, looked at Grady in the way of someone who was about to say something they had been organizing for longer than this conversation. "I owe you an explanation," she said. "You don't," he said. "I do. Not negotiating. Sael was sent here without her name because I wanted to understand what this station did with someone it had no obligation to protect." She paused. "I have done this before, on other stations. I sent people I trusted without their names and watched what happened." "I know," Grady said. "You told the chamber. I am telling you differently," she said. He waited. "On the other stations," she said, "the test produced data, useful data, painful data, the kind that informed policy and closed gaps and made systems more accountable." She looked at her hands. "I told myself that was enough, that the pain of the test was justified by the improvement of the system." The cafeteria was very quiet around them. Not because anyone was listening, because the room had somehow understood the way rooms did sometimes that something real was being said in it. "I was measuring the system," the Empress said. "I was not measuring what it cost her to be the instrument." Grady looked at Sile. Sile was looking at the table. Her hands were in her lap, folded. Same position as the first day at the far table in front of the untouched tray. But different now. Not trying to disappear. just sitting with something big. She's 11, Grady said. Yes, you sent her alone. Yes, for 23 days. Yes, each yes smaller than the last, each one landing differently. Not defensively, just accurately. The way someone accepted an accounting when they had decided to be honest about the total. I know what I did, the Empress said quietly. I know what it looked like from where she was sitting. She paused. I know because I watched every day of it. Then you saw the far table, yes, and the granola bars, yes. And now something moved in her voice, something small and genuine, and the peanut butter, and the corridor maintenance calls, and the sensor you installed on day 8 because you noticed a gap in coverage that nobody else had bothered to notice. Grady said nothing. You were not supposed to be in this, she said. The test is designed around absence, around the systems, not around she stopped, around a maintenance technician who shows up at the far table because he once watched someone he loved sit alone and decided that was not acceptable. He looked at her. How do you know about that? I told you, she said. I watched every day. He thought about that, about day 3, about Ellen, about the specific conversation he'd had with Sael, about notes left behind, and voicemails not yet played, and the fact that 4 years of data was enough to know something about someone. He'd thought that conversation was private. It was not private. He wasn't sure whether that bothered him. He filed it in the same place as the drone, and the 8 seconds and the word yes said 3 times smaller each time. Why didn't you answer sooner, he said. When she activated the pendant, the Empress was quiet. I received the signal, she said. At 11:07, he did the math. You were watching before Ashmo classified it. I was always watching. Then why? Because she said I needed to know if you would open the door. The cafeteria did its thing around them. Someone dropped a fork. A monitor floated past the far window. The decorative plant from the low-gravity moon continued its long, slow project of not quite dying. Grady looked at the Empress. That's a hard thing, he said, to need to know that. Yes, she said, it is. And if I hadn't, she looked at him steadily. Then I would have opened it myself, and then I would have known something different. A pause. About the station, about the system, about whether the gap I was measuring was larger than I had understood. And now I know it's smaller, she said, by exactly one person. He thought about that, about being the measurement, about the fact that somewhere in the royal records of Dominion space, there was a category he now inhabited, the one person on the 7th station who had walked across the cafeteria. He didn't know how he felt about being a category. He knew how he felt about the walk. Mr. Wren, the Empress said, Grady, Grady. She said it like she was trying out the shape of it. I would like to ask you something. Okay, why did you help her before you knew who she was? He'd been asked this before, in the chamber, under white lights, with his wrists in soft blue restraints and officials in floating seats and the whole room listening for the grand answer. He hadn't had a grand answer then. He didn't have one now. He looked at Sael, at the jacket around her shoulders, at the notepad on the bench behind her with the word potluck written in careful handwriting, at the amber eyes that were too old for her face, but were right now watching her grandmother with something that looked tentatively carefully, the way all of Sael's best things were tentative and careful, like hope. Because kids shouldn't have to be important before somebody cares, he said. The Empress looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her granddaughter, and said quietly, not for the room, not for the record, not for any of the attendants standing at a respectful distance with their formal feelings, said just to Sael, I should have been at this table sooner. Sael looked at her grandmother. For a moment, her face did the thing it did when she was holding something large, when she was deciding what to do with an emotion she hadn't used before. The careful, slow process of finding out if the hinges still worked. Then she reached out, picked up her piece of sandwich, cut it in half with a plastic knife very precisely, and pushed one half across the table toward the Empress. Didn't say anything, just pushed it over. The Empress looked at the half piece of sandwich, at her granddaughter's hand still near it, at the table that had been the far table, the one nobody chose on purpose, the one with the dying plant from a low-gravity moon and the decorative function nobody had ever been grateful for until a man from Savannah, Georgia, started sitting there every day at lunch. She picked up the half piece, and it was not a grand moment. It was not the kind of thing that made it into official histories. There were no cameras positioned correctly. The attendants were looking at a point slightly above the table. The cafeteria had gone back to its ordinary business. But Grady saw it, a grandmother and a granddaughter at a table that had been wrong for everything and turned out to be right for this. He looked at his coffee. Cold. Terrible. Consistent. Drank it. Put his cup down, looked at his tablet, looked at the contact photo Mara had set as her profile picture, a picture of her holding a fish she'd caught on a trip last summer, laughing hat sideways, completely unbothered by anything, in a way that made his chest do the thing it did when he'd been away too long. He pressed call. 2 rings. Dad surprised, warm, the slight catch in her voice of someone who'd been waiting for something and had stopped expecting it and was now receiving it. Is everything okay? Yeah, he said, just checking in. Just a short laugh. It's been a while. I know. You okay? He looked at the table, at the Empress listening to her granddaughter explain with great scientific seriousness the precise mechanism by which peanut butter adhered to the roof of a mammalian mouth, and why this did not, in her revised assessment, detract from the overall experience. Yeah, Grady said. I'm okay. Something happened. Some things happened. Good things or bad things, he thought about that. About day 1 and day 23 and everything between them. About the far table and the thermal log, and 8 seconds of silence, and a sandwich cut into 3 uneven pieces. About a backup sensor installed on day 8 because he had noticed a gap. About a pendant activated on day 23 because someone decided he was worth protecting back. Mostly good, he said. Eventually. Mara laughed. He could hear her settling into wherever she was, the couch probably the one she'd had since college that she refused to replace because it was structurally sound. Dad, you just have to know where to sit. The sound of her being somewhere warm and familiar and fully, completely herself. Tell me, she said. So he did. Not all of it. Not the log or the chamber or the column of light. Just the part that had started it. The far table, the girl with the untouched tray, the half sandwich pushed across, and the careful way it had been accepted like it might change its mind. Mara was quiet when he finished. Then, she sounds like she has good taste. 6 out of 10 on granola bars, Grady said. Very consistent. Sounds like someone. I don't know what you mean. You rate coffee the same way every morning. On a scale of 1 to I rate it accurately. You rated the hospital coffee a 3.5. It was a 3.5. It was terrible and you know it. 3.5 is not a good score. Mara laughed again. Longer this time. The laugh he could have picked out of any room in any building on any planet in any galaxy. He held the phone and listened to it. "Come home soon," she said when it settled. 14 months, he said, give or take. 14 months, she said. "Okay, I'll keep the couch. The couch is fine. I know. I just like telling you it's fine." After they said goodbye, he sat for a moment with the phone still warm in his hand. The cafeteria moved around him. Morning shift, people eating, trays being cleared. The decorative plant from the low-gravity moon had gotten somehow a small container of water next to it. A maintenance tag attached. Grady hadn't put it there. He looked at it. Then at Wex passing through the far corridor, who did not look at him. He looked at the plant, then at the table. Sayel was explaining something to the Empress about the structural properties of crackers as a peanut butter delivery system. The Empress was listening, actually listening, with the focused, patient attention of someone who had decided that this particular information was important because of who was delivering it and not the other way around. Grady watched them. The most powerful woman in the known galaxy and her granddaughter, sitting at the wrong table, in the corner, by the plant that was no longer entirely dying, eating sandwiches. It was not a grand moment. It was not the kind of thing that speeches got made about later. It was just a table, and the people at it, and the fact that sometimes the most important things happen when nobody was performing them for anyone. He finished his coffee, stood up, picked up his tool bag, clipped his badge on slightly crooked, same as always. "I've got sub-level 3, he said, "and the West Learning Ring filter." Sayel looked up. 7 out of 10 probability you will need the larger wrench. "I was going to take the larger wrench." "Good." The Empress looked at him, and for the first time the expression on her face was not measuring him, not cataloging, not running the calculation of who he was and what he represented, just looking at a person at her granddaughter's table who had shown up for 23 days and intended clearly to keep showing up. "Mr. Wren," she said. "Grady." Grady. A pause. Something in her voice that had not been there before. Something very small and not at all imperial. "Thank you." He nodded, picked up his bag, walked across the cafeteria, past the center tables where conversations had started to sound different, less sharp, more present, past the monitor floating near the window that adjusted its course slightly when he walked under it. He still wasn't entirely sure about that drone, and he'd decided he was probably never going to be fully sure, and that was fine. Past the service counter where a cafeteria worker he'd never talked to held up a fresh cup of coffee. He stopped. "For you," the worker said. "On the house." Grady looked at the coffee, looked at the worker. "What's the rating?" he said. The worker blinked. "I don't—" "On a scale of 1 to 10, Grady said, where 1 is that machine over there and 10 is something your grandmother would approve of." The worker thought about it. 6, they said. Maybe 6.5. Grady took the cup. "That's good," he said. "That's honestly pretty good." And walked out into the corridor where the air smelled like recycled oxygen and machine oil and something that was almost beginning to resemble a place where a person could stay for a while. 14 months, give or take. He had sub-level 3 to get to. He had a filter in the West Learning Ring with opinions about itself. He had a crew of 1 wax probably already at the equipment bay, probably already organized in the way that people organize themselves when they'd survived a terrifying morning and come out better on the other side. He had a coffee that was a 6.5. He had a daughter in Georgia on a couch that was structurally sound if you knew where to sit. He had a table at the far end of the cafeteria that was not the far table anymore. And he had a granola bar rating system that had been revised upward. In context. Because context mattered, he kept walking. The corridor stretched ahead. Other technicians nodded as he passed. Different this morning. Something in the angle of the nods, like the station itself, had reset overnight to something closer to what it was supposed to be. Maybe it had. He didn't need to understand it fully to keep walking. He just needed the larger wrench, and he had that too.